shortly. I request the audience to please take your seat. We will be starting shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, and the viewers of the Tibet Online TV, welcome back to 2019 Geneva Forum. We will be starting the panel number 4, titled Combating Fears of a China-Led Orwellian World. I request the moderator, Honorable former Envoy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Mr. Kesa Genzela, to please come over to the dais. I would like to invite the speakers, Honorable Member of European Parliament, Czech Pirate Party, Mr. Mikolas Peksa, please. Program Manager and Human Rights Advocate, International Service for Human Rights, Sarah Brooks. Member of Canadian Parliament and co-chair of the Canadian Parliamentary Friends of Tibet, Garnet Jenius. And Honorable Representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Office of Tibet, Brussels, Mr. Tashpinzola. Sorry. I request Kesa Genzela to take over, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I welcome you all to the final session of Geneva Forum 2019 on China's high-tech repression and freedom of religion. These 2 days have been, for me personally, very moving and inspiring when I listened to the personal statements of members of Uyghur, Hong Kong, China, Chinese and Tibetan communities. Their personal story of suffering, sacrifice, but also of their courage, determination, and spirit of resistance has been tremendously inspiring. And we had also the opportunity to listen to researchers, defenders of human rights, with special expertise on the use of high-tech tools that violate fundamental human rights. In that context, I remembered a statement by Albert Einstein. He once said that the world is not threatened by people who are evil, but by those who do let evil happen. That means by those people who look away when evil takes place, who are silent and who don't oppose it. During these 2 days, a number of people gathered here. Most of them, I'm sure, each of them has decided for oneself or herself not to look away when such things happened, not to be silent and not to be indifferent, but to make a difference. And making a difference not only by not looking away, but also by becoming personally involved and engaged in the active and global defense of fundamental human rights. Therefore, I think this gathering is not anti-China, anti-Chinese, but against the policies of a totalitarian regime whose policies violate the fundamental freedoms of many people, and especially the minorities in China. So I just want to make these brief remarks. Now to our panelists. It's my pleasure to welcome Mikula Peksa, is this right? Peksa, yeah. Mikula Peksa is, you are a researcher and a software engineer, but he is, since 2013, a member of the Czech Pirate Party. It's a very strange name, by the way. No.
There is a good reason for that.
Yeah, okay, you explained it. So, and he is elected to the parliament in Czech in 2017, and is also, since 2019, a member of the European Parliament. So it's my pleasure to welcome you. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Oops. Thank you. May I ask for the slides, maybe? Hope it happens. Yeah, maybe just to start to introduce myself and maybe the pirates. Just to explain it, the very first pirate party was formed in 2006 in Sweden, and the actual reason for forming a pirate party was the fact that so-called anti-pirate organizations were hunting students sharing files on the internet. And that was the reason why Pirate Party was formed, because we originally started as a movement protecting people from being haunted or chased on the internet. Gradually it expanded to other areas, not only because of the copyright, but the movement has in its DNA the struggle for the freedom of the internet, for the freedom of the expression, for the freedom of information. That's why we call ourselves pirates. Maybe it's a little bit weird name. However, we bear it proudly, and it helped us a lot. I have to make this promo, as I'm currently serving chairperson of the European Pirate Party, so I'm kind of like representing the movement, and in a way I should probably be proud of the fact that the topic of the discussion we have currently today is something we have been warning from maybe the very start of our movement. But to be honest, I would prefer to be wrong rather than see this nightmare happening. The digital oppression and the digital rights have seen a huge decline in the last years. However, I still think there is a chance to reverse the process and to ensure our freedom. Maybe let's look on to China directly, because this is the example or the case where we see all the wrong things at the one place, forming together a very dangerous system. The Chinese Communist Party basically established a system which uses advanced technology in order to monitor the population, to look who is like friend and who is foe for the existing regime. It uses this developed technology to limit citizens' freedom of expression and right to the information, so that the people have a restricted view, are becoming or are getting very restricted world view and like the understanding of the processes in society. The collaboration with the regime is being rewarded in order to promote those ideas, and on the other hand, those who are being seen as a foes for the regime are being punished or in worst case executed by its authorities. Last but not least, and it should be mentioned especially in this place, there are groups which are inherently considered to be foes of that regime, and those are by design being prosecuted and marginalized in their whole life. The monitoring of the population should remind one term I like. It's surveillance capitalism. In fact, the regime we see in China has not that much to do with the regimes we have seen before 1989 in the Eastern Europe and Russia. It's no longer communism in the former sense of that word, but it's rather closer to the capitalism, but in very perverted form. There is basically the idea, or like the core issue is that the regime is very much gathering the data in order to really know every single aspect of its citizens' life. There was a huge leap in forward with the expansion of smartphones, because it basically provides plenty of data that can be later used about your movement, about your friends, your activities you do. Everything like that is in the smartphones and other parts of the IoT. Together with the ongoing boom in the field of artificial intelligence, which allows really effective data mining on that data, it provides very dangerous weapon. Like, for example, together with the camera in the public spaces and the existing technology of the facial recognition, you are more or less able to follow and watch and follow every single person where it is walking, what is he or she doing, and assess whether it's loyal or disloyal to the regime. There is one thing we have been talking for some years already, and it's called Great Chinese Firewall. In fact, it's a way how to restrict the access to the internet from China to the rest of the world, and some other pages. I think everyone within the China can easily check it. You will see, just by simple technical means, that the latency of your connection to the outer world is somehow worse. I think there were huge discussions about that with respect to, for example, big blockchain technology or cryptocurrencies in general, because, for example, Bitcoin is very much dependent of having network of computers all over the world, and when the computers which are behind a big Chinese firewall are somehow being slowed because that firewall, it affects the effectivity of the whole network. However, a part of this kind of protective capability to prevent people from seeing things, it is also an important edge for Chinese domestic technological companies. They use it as a form of protectionism in order to prosper and provide new more and better technologies to Chinese government in order to use it for its purposes. Of course, the original idea was blocking messaging and getting information from the outer world, so that the people are really living in a bubble of things that are not harmful for the regime, and they cannot even realize that there is something wrong with the world they are living in. The system as such is quite capable of rewarding of the collaboration. The reason is that the existing algorithms for assessment of data are good enough to connect all the information about your transactions, about your movement, friends, and so on, what you do. So it provides a simple way how to assess people, whether they are loyal or disloyal. And in fact, this provides a tool for broad discrimination, either in, let's say, positive or negative sense, in all areas of men's lives. A part of oppressing or promoting the citizens, Communist Party of China is proactively supporting the tech companies that are developing such technologies. So it is really like a form of state capitalism that that's self-sustaining. They really have very effective environment for supporting of startups and scale-ups in order to improve the technology, because startups are basically those companies that are driving force of the technological progress. The punishment for the citizens can be of various form, like you could not receive a license to do the profession you would like. Your accounts on social networks can be blocked. I've heard about some from maybe European perspective funny stories, but it's actually not funny, that someone was not allowed to buy a train ticket because he was not considered to be loyal enough to the regime. And it can be even more harmful, like your personal data or your personal conversation, including, for example, very intimate details, can be published, and your whole personality can be damaged or destroyed in a kind of inscenate or orchestrated process. As there is this level of possible punishments, it's quite easy for the government to enforce the collaboration by use of blackmail or threatening the people that could be possibly affected by that effects. The worst part is that actually some groups have no chance to really obey the regime rules, as they are inherently considered to be enemies of the regime or being undesirable. The government declares its atheistic policies, which inherently means persecution of religious and also the ethnic minorities. A part of the actions like destroying of the churches, there can be even more subtle ways how to undermine these organizations. For example, limiting their visibility on the social media so that people are not aware of them, and they don't know when something they will not join such an organization, and also cannot protest when members of the minority are being persecuted. Maybe it's nice to sit in Switzerland, in the center of Europe, and feel it like this is something that happens in some place far from here, which does not affect us. But this is definitely not a right feeling about the problem. The internet is global, and that means that whatever happens in China will affect our lives as well. The technology which is being developed in communist China is being exported to the other countries, like for example Vietnam, which are more and more sliding towards the similar system in a way. On the other hand, the Western corporations, the multinationals, are gathering data for various purposes. We can talk about Google, Facebook, Amazon, and many other big companies. They do it. The problem is when the data are being collected, it's only up to discussion of those who are possessing them whether they could be used for such a form of surveillance as well. And then it is always a discussion with the existing power of Chinese authorities or the other regimes that could try to use it. This view is quite bleak for the future of our freedom, but I think there are still some hopes, and we should definitely do more on those topics. Maybe some simple rules that should be upheld. First of all, the citizens' privacy must be protected. In Europe, fortunately, we have GDPR. It's not perfect, but it prevents the situation that all our data would be gathered on one single heap and data mined in order to evaluate the people according to their political views. On the other hand, when we talk about the privacy for citizens, we should talk about full transparency of the state. When the state and its internal processes are being transparent, it can be assessed and it prevents that there are misuses within the state organization. We should always remember the idea of human rights. It's being forgotten, but we should always remind that wherever it comes to, because it's important that all the people have their rights granted. It's especially important with regard to the right to the information, to be informed properly about the real state of art, and the right of privacy to be not spied on. We must fight for this principle and not compromise on that. And as it was said, it's not only a Chinese problem. Internet is global, and whatever happens, it will spread across. So we all have to care about where we are, where the world is moving. So altogether, we need to promote active internet policies, independent. Whatever we are talking about, data mining, cloud storage, cybersecurity, digitization, it's all connected together. It's a very important field of policy, which is quite often forgotten and seen as something technocratic, which can be solved by bureaucrats. But we really need to strive for clear policies based on a will for freedom. So at this point, that's all for me. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm fully open to your questions.
Thank you. It's really quite horrifying if these high-tech tools are in the wrong hands of people in government. As a Tibetan, we knew right from the beginning in '59 that the whole system of Chinese communism is destroying the very fabric of family life and society, where each other do not trust, and everyone is spying on each other. Everywhere is spooks, informants. But now with this technology, it gets a dimension, and it's really horrifying. Thank you very much for your presentation. Our next speaker is Sarah Brooks. Sarah, she leads the International Service for Human Rights work and supports human rights defenders in Asia, as well as defenders of migrants' rights everywhere in the world. Sarah has also worked as a liaison of her organization to the EU institutions, and prior to it, she advanced their US foreign policy in the areas of workers' rights and support on supply chains. Sarah, you are welcome to speak.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you again to the organizers for having me here. So I've decided that as you come to the end of 2 days of meeting, to try to approach this question of how to combat fear rather from a perspective of how to try to build hope or find hope. So let's see how that goes. Just very quickly as an introduction, the International Service for Human Rights was founded in 1984. We are based here in Geneva and work with human rights defenders around the world to help excuse me, to help them and their organizations decide how or why or when they might choose to use the UN human rights system as a tool for helping their advocacy objectives to be realized. And in that context, we work across a range of different jurisdictions, a range of different thematic populations. But as the kind moderator has said, my focus for the last 5 years with the organization has been on working with defenders in Asia. So I wanted to also start with a few caveats. Because of that background, my presentation will necessarily be given through a specific and explicit Geneva lens, thinking about how we see and experience Chinese influence and the potential for pushback here in Geneva. The second is I want to address technology largely through examples, finding both the positives and the negatives in the experience that we've had, and also drawing positive and negative experiences or lessons learned, you could say, from ISHR's work in other countries. I think that's quite important and always helpful for us to remember that there are many experiences of repression, both technological and quite primeval in many cases that are not in China and that actually are unfortunately a shared trend across the world. And then the final caveat is when I say China and I speak about the UN, I want to be very clear. I am talking about the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the administration of Xi Jinping in their implementation of CCP policy. I'll use China as shorthand, but I think it's really important that we all do have a very clear idea of who we're talking about and that this is not in any way meant to imply that China is or should be a coherent whole, nor that there is not some contention within what we see as China. So with that, I think the first step to thinking about how we can use the UN system as a tool for hope is really about mapping the terrain. One of the areas that we've worked quite a lot on is understanding China's strategies in the UN space. And basically these fall into 3 categories. The desire to protect Chinese interests, to advance the Chinese agenda, and to build alliances between the Chinese delegation here and other delegations working in and around the UN. So the link, if I were able to click on it at this point, actually shows an image from China's recent Universal Periodic Review. This is the human rights review that happened in November, actually just about 1 year ago. And using that as an example, we actually see all 3 of these strategies being put into place. The first, in terms of protecting their image and their interests, China sought repeatedly to prevent activists from attending, sought to discourage diplomats and civil society, as well as media, from attending certain meetings, and very much approached any information that came from independent sources as being groundless, as lacking justification, and as being non-credible. This is very much a defensive act. At the same time, China also sought to advance an agenda. and this is largely structured around its engagement with other UN member states to make recommendations referring to, for example, a shared future for the community of mankind, to generate consensus around a China model of development and human rights. And unfortunately, I think the consensus is that they were largely successful in, on the surface, using this platform provided by the UN to achieve those objectives. I finally want to talk a bit about how, through the UPR, we can see China building alliances. They were able to not only ensure that there was quite laudatory language in the process of the review itself, but at the adoption of the some 12 countries that were able to speak publicly at the Human Rights Council, all but 2 were very optimistic about the human rights situation in China, praising the government's actions specifically in poverty alleviation. And from countries as diverse as North Korea and Cameroon, specifically applauding China's approach to counterterrorism and management of its minority populations. So not only did they have positive things said, but they were able to find people to come to their defense. And I think that's an important strategy to keep in mind. When we also do mapping the train, I think it's important to recognize the constraints of the UN system, both practical in terms of who can get in the door, in terms of, while we're talking about high tech, I think the UN is a decidedly low tech kind of organization. So what are the risks that come with that? But also political constraints. And I'm sure that's been a subject of quite a bit of discussion over the last 2 days in looking at how political and economic pressure coincide to ensure that multilateral spaces are generally favorable to China's interests. That was kind of bleak, but I think recognizing our gains is a really important step in this. Thinking about how there have been positive changes, even over the last 6 years under Xi Jinping, where we've seen decidedly better outcomes from using the UN human rights system. So from the perspective of civil society, I think never before have I seen so much interest in what is happening. So many individuals from all different kinds of organizations, walks of life, countries, seeking to use the UN human rights mechanisms to address human rights issues related to China. Some of these may be Han Chinese lawyers. Some may be people living and working in Hong Kong or Tibet. But also, I think, again, using the UPR as an example, we saw communities based in Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia who are concerned about the impact of Chinese businesses and Chinese corporate interest in their countries, seeking to fight back, seeking to use the system to encourage China to do a better job of regulating those companies. That's something new, and also I think not something we'd seen before, this diversity and this coordination. Among the UN mechanisms themselves, I think particularly the UN special procedures and the UN treaty bodies are acting in ways with respect to China that they've not really acted before. Just 2 weeks ago, the UN special procedures sent a letter to the Chinese government focusing on the counterterrorism law and on the implementing regulations in Xinjiang. While the letter was nominally just a legal analysis comparing China's laws to international obligations, it's an incredibly powerful indictment of the way in which China implements its counterterrorism laws, specifically to discourage dissent, to silence critical voices, and to isolate and criminalize a whole range of actions and increasingly identities, including those of Tibetans and Uyghurs. The UN treaty bodies, I imagine many in this room followed the review by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination last year, which was the first time the Chinese government had to stand up publicly on camera and provide an explanation for their policies in Xinjiang, and specifically for the internment of over 1 million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims. The coverage of that meeting, and I think the subsequent comments from the committee members have been incredibly powerful and have actually provided civil society, governments, and media with a lot of tools to be able to further question what exactly is happening in these places. And I should add that China has now responded to some of the committee's questions, including on issues of Xinjiang, of the role of foreign NGOs, and of bilingual language education. So there is a kind of back and forth and a way of getting more information that we might not otherwise have had. I think that's an important gain to recognize. Finally, I raised governments, and I think we've seen increasing willingness by governments to try to use the UN spaces creatively, to speak, if not with one single voice, then with many voices at one time, to increase the pressure on China to change its laws and its policies to improve the respect for human rights. Oh, and just as a small shout out to the EU, I think they've done something very special in particular, which is to be able to use what the UN actually says about China to achieve consensus within the EU. And that's, again, a very practical way of seeing how what's done in the UN can actually be relevant for much broader conversations. The final step that I want to focus on is about sharing our stories and spaces. And this will sort of, I think under each of these points, highlight both some of the challenges, but then also some of the value or some of the potential of how we might see the UN system as a tool for hope and for change. So the first thing I think is critical in this is improving communication about the UN's actions. The fact of the matter is they do quite a lot. And while I'm not always happy, I'm often pleasantly surprised. They do a very bad job of communicating that, though, for a whole range of reasons. So it really comes, I think, back to those of us who believe that the UN can be a useful tool to do a more focused and comprehensive and intensive job of making what they say or write on paper or post on a website somewhere actually meaningful and useful and concrete in our work and in the lives of those impacted by China's policies. So the case that I pulled out here is a campaign we did for the International Day for the Victims of Enforced Disappearances, which is August 30th. So this year we highlighted 5 stories from among Chinese human rights lawyers, Tibetans, and Uyghurs, talking about the impact of disappearances on families. But in addition to this social media campaign, we also did diplomatic outreach. We had a range of op-eds placed both in English, Chinese, and French, highlighting the issue. And we provided tools for activists and defenders in English and in Chinese to try and have them become more aware of what the UN does on enforced disappearances and how somebody who's a victim of enforced disappearance can try to use this system to get more information and ultimately to get justice. The second thing that's really important is monitoring and reporting on China's engagement on the UN, as well as the UN's engagement with China. And I think this is a really interesting discussion when we talk about tech, because one of the most powerful tools we have for monitoring and reporting on what China does is actually just the webcast. Everything they do in Room 20, everything they do in a public UN space is pretty much public. We can see it. It's not always easy, but it's there. And I think that is a change where we can see technology working for good. By contrast, though, there needs to be kind of time and resources and real thought put into having done research, having thought about the analysis, having looked at China's strategies. Where and how do we share that with policymakers? How do we make that impact on the decisions that people are taking? And then finally, I think advocating for increased space for civil society is incredibly important. It can no longer it's no longer tenable that organizations that happen to be based in Geneva or in Europe, or that happen to have a certain status, are the only ones that are able to speak, or the only ones that are able to influence. And so ISHR's work with the NGO committee is incredibly important, seeking to lower the threshold or remove the political barriers to having more active civil society engagement. It's worth noting that on the NGO committee, there are only 2 of 20 members from Europe. Add the US in there, and you've got a pretty stark view of, who is basically fighting the fight at the UN for NGO access, and it's not a lot of people. So there's plenty of work to do there. In terms of physical access, I do want to highlight one last thing on technology. There are real risks with seeking to engage with the UN. Some of you may have seen reporting of Chinese officials requesting information from the UN about who has gained access, about who has been able to register for certain conferences. I think in some cases this is not entirely the full story, but I think in all cases it's really important to think about. And for individuals who are at risk, for defenders who are working on the ground and who are seeking to confront China, this is a very real and concrete issue. The increasing move towards digitalization in the UN has meant that it is almost impossible to gain access to those spaces without applying online. That therefore means that you have to have a reasonable confidence in data privacy policies and in the data management and security of the UN systems. And I think that's one area where significant attention and advocacy could be used to help ensure that that is truly about facilitating participation rather than making it riskier. I'm happy to take questions afterwards and talk more, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. I think your presentation about how UN mechanism can be used in an effective and positive way is also very important for us Tibetans. I think I'm not disclosing any secret of the Tibetans if I say there is among Tibetans also Tibetans of divided opinion. Some hold the view that UN is just a talking shop and not at all, fair and just, where only interests of the nation state prevail. So some Tibetans are of the opinion the limited resources we have at our disposal as a refugee community, we should use it in other forums where it can be, used in a more effective way. But still, our political leadership, our city, we still think this is a very important international body. And most probably, if there were no United Nations organization, people will immediately call for such an international organization. So that's the reality. So therefore, thank you very much for your presentation. Our next speaker is Garnet Genius. He is a member of the Canadian Parliament and a shadow foreign minister of the opposition party. Is it correct? Yeah. And Garnet is also a passionate human rights champion. He is the international patron of the Hong Kong Watch and the vice chair of the Tibetan Parliamentary Friends of Canada. And what struck me in your bio is your grandmother has a very strong influence on you. She was a Holocaust survivor, and that really made an impact on Garnet, and one of the reasons for his passion for human rights seems to be from his grandmother. Please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Tashi Delek. Bonjour, mes amis francophones. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I want to thank the Tibet office here in Geneva for putting together this excellent forum. And it's great that my wife, Rebecca, has been able to join me for these last 2 days after getting a sense of the picture and what's happening with China and the sophistication of the government. She suggested we increase our life insurance policy. So I guess we'll have to do that when we get back. But okay, Deng Xiaoping said that China was content to hide its strength and bide its time. In the past, Chinese leaders have spoken in a way designed to provide Western leaders with hope that they are in fact gradually transforming China in the direction of a free, open, and democratic society. But now the act is very much over. China's leaders are no longer content to hide and bide. China's leaders now appear to believe that their political model is better. They don't want to change it. In fact, they want to propagate it. So today, as we've discussed throughout this conference, we're confronting the reality of a materialistic, authoritarian political model, very much like that described in George Orwell's 1984, in the world's most populous nation and second largest economy. We confront the threat of that model on the move. And as we confront that threat, it is critical to have a strong sense of solidarity among those who oppose and wish to resist the advance of that model. We need Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Christians, Chinese democracy activists, free people throughout the world standing together and working together for the advance of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in China and elsewhere. And it's been great to see that solidarity on display throughout this conference. And even on this panel, we have a cause bringing together a pirate and a conservative. So that's an unlikely, but I think important combination. So the topic for this panel is combating fears of a China-led Orwellian world. By Orwellian, we're talking, of course, about the world imagined by George Orwell in his famous works, most notably 1984. Orwell's work is a poignant description of the kind of system that currently exists in China. And I'm sure many of you have read it and are also familiar with these trends. The system of social credit, media and digital censorship and control, the subversion and control of all institutions under party domination, constant surveillance, whether by telescreens or cameras. This is a tightening reality and a spreading challenge. Orwell's work very much helps us understand what is happening in China right now. But I do note one particular difference. In 1984, the authoritarian materialist state is constantly at war with its neighbors. Orwell seems to have taken for granted that the expansion of such a model would be resisted and would only be possible through overwhelming violence. Yet today, many elites in the West seem not merely indifferent to, but rather excited about the growing influence and capacity of China's government. How are we to make sense of the Western response to the rising risk of a world dominated by a power whose political model is the very model which we know to be most undesirable? For us to understand our response, I think we need to go beyond 1984 and consider an American movie made in 1993 called An Indecent Proposal. Perhaps one day it will be as iconic as 1984, although I doubt it. An Indecent Proposal is about a young couple named David and Diane Murphy, wildly in love, full of hopes and dreams, and relatively poor. They have financial dreams which cannot be realized, and so they go to Las Vegas to roll the dice and to try to get ahead. Not a path most financial advisors would endorse. This couple is a bit materialistic, not in the Marxist sense of materialistic, but in the typically Western sense. They theoretically believe in values beyond the material, such as love and happiness, but they have things that they want which they believe will make them happy, and they desperately want the money to buy the things that will make their dreams come true. They do not embrace the theoretical materialism of Marxism, which says that the material is all that matters, but they have a practical materialism which sees money as the path to getting the things they want. So as a result, they really want more money. Enter John Gage, a charming billionaire played by Robert Redford. Gage is also in Vegas, and Gage falls head over heels in lust with Mrs. Murphy. Early in the evening, out of the blue, he tries to buy her a beautiful dress with a plunging neckline. She refuses, telling him, "The dress is for sale, I am not." A conversation occurs later in the evening in which Mr. Gage and the Murphys discuss further the nature and limits of what money can buy. Diane Murphy tells John Gage, "You can't buy people, not when real emotions are involved." Gage tells her that that is a silly cliche and then tests the theory with his indecent proposal. He offers the couple $1 million for one night with Mrs. Murphy. The Murphys refuse initially, but the gnawing pressure of the offer, of the opportunity to realize all of their dreams, leads them to eventually decide together that one night is worth it. Mrs. Murphy does sleep with John Gage, and after that, the Murphys' marriage is wrought by the pain of the event and by nagging doubts in the minds of Mr. Murphy that it hadn't just been about the money. It's a tragic story, although still one with a happy ending, and it raises powerful questions about what aspects of ourselves and our identities are and are not for sale. Now here's another story, this time about the famous English playwright George Bernard Shaw. Apparently at a party once, Shaw approached a woman and said, "Madam, if I give you 10,000 pounds, would you sleep with me?" She blushed slightly and then said quietly, "Well, yes, I think I would." Shaw paused and then said, "Madam, would you sleep with me for a farthing?" At this point, she became angry and said, "Mr. Shaw, what kind of a woman do you think I am?" He replied, "Madam, we've already established that. Now we're just haggling." And one more story, this from my own country. In 1952, a town in Quebec desperately needed a bridge built. The premier, expected to win the election overall, told the people of that district that unless they elected a candidate from his party, they would not get their bridge. He was told in response by a young Liberal politician, "I will cross the river swimming, but I will never cross the river on my knees." So my friends, nobody wants to live in an Orwellian world. Nobody truly wants the communist system to be imposed on themselves and their families. China's government's agents in the West are very happy to be in the West. The problem is not that the system itself is attractive. It is rather that too many of our elites and our elite institutions are being seduced by money. Universities need the revenue from international students. Some political parties look for various forms of direct and indirect financial support which may have roots abroad. Businesses may prioritize the bottom line above all else, and governments worry about disrupted trade relationships and resulting negative electoral consequences. None of them want theoretical materialism, but their practical materialism makes them vulnerable to Chinese government seduction. What we need are universities, our political parties, our businesses, and our governments to declare in clear and unified terms is that the dress is for sale, but I am not. I will cross the river swimming, but I will never cross the river on my knees. Simply put, we will do business with you, but we will not sell our souls. Why have we failed to thus far be so clear? The stories that we tell ourselves, the songs we sing, everything about our cultural heritage has taught us that there are some things which money cannot buy. That selling yourself, that selling out, is a deeply undesirable thing. The problem is that there is a strange paradox in our civilization which mirrors a different paradox in China. I've alluded to this already. In China, the theoretical materialism of Marxism is the official doctrine advanced by the state. The material world is all that there is, and therefore the only thing that matters is material and economic advancement. Human rights are redefined in purely materialistic terms, as if economic prosperity were more important than religious, cultural, and political freedoms. In fact, as if economic prosperity were the only thing that mattered at all. This is the official philosophy of the Chinese state. And any time one raises issues of human rights, these concerns are parried by claims about China's economic growth, because the official philosophy suggests that selling out what we call basic human rights for economic growth is in fact quite reasonable and sensible. This is the official doctrine of materialism. Of course, we know that theoretical materialism is rejected by overwhelming and growing numbers of Chinese people. The growth of various spiritual movements in China, despite oppression, suggests that the people of China are rejecting materialism and searching for a connection with spiritual truths. Spirituality, the idea that there are truths and realities outside of the material world which gives purpose and meaning to material reality, is the direct opposite of materialism. Movements for human rights are in this sense always spiritual, in that they call us to defend the idea that human beings are more than just their material composition, that they have transcendent value. We cannot detect your human rights by examining your material biology. Our sense of real human rights comes from the idea that there are non-material truths. Not only are Chinese people rejecting theoretical materialism, but this materialism is at odds with China's own rich intellectual history. During a recent visit to China, I shared my own favorite line from the Analytics of Confucius with Chinese officials. They weren't expecting this. Confucius described himself as a man driven by so much passion that in his enthusiasm he often forgets to eat and remains unaware of the onset of old age. In another passage, Confucius is asked by Sikyong, one of his disciples, what critical things a government must provide. The master said, enough food, enough weapons, and the confidence of the people. Sikyong said, suppose you had no alternative but to give up one of these three. Which one would you let go of first? The master said, weapons. Sikyong said, what if you had to give up one of the two remaining? Which would it be? The master said, food. From ancient times, death has come to all men, but a people without confidence in its rulers will not stand. So clearly Confucius was not a materialist. China has state-imposed theoretical materialism which is discordant with its own heritage and with the sentiments of its people. In the West, we do not have theoretical materialism, but we do have practical materialism. While asserting that money cannot buy love, that our values are not for sale, etc., we very often behave as if we think otherwise. We obsess about our material position and sacrifice familial, community, and cultural connections to advance our economic position. Our political conversations are obsessed with financial considerations, and our own individual decisions sometimes reflect these same obsessions. This is not a problem of economic structure or system. It's rather a question of whether we still believe in spiritual values that supersede the material. When we say that certain things are not for sale in our lives, do we believe that, or do we just say it? The infiltration of Chinese state organs into our own societies is the result of the alignment between the theoretical materialism of the Chinese state and the practical materialism of at least many elites in Western societies, who are willing to compromise on fundamental values so that they and their institutions can get ahead. When a society is vulnerable to penetration, we cannot only blame the aggressor. We have to also ask what factors have made us vulnerable and how we can change them. How can we teach our elites that there are things in life more important than money, power, and institutional success? If we do not do that successfully, then all of the things we have are for sale. It's no longer a question of the kind of people we are, it is just a question of the price. And then the practical materialists in the West will be bought out by the theoretical materialists in China until there is little left to sell. I want to share now a little bit about the particular challenges we have in the Canada-China relationship, because I think those experiences illustrate well the broader problem that our nations face. So from 2006 to 2015, Canada was governed by a Conservative government led by Stephen Harper. Harper substantially changed the direction of Canadian foreign policy, emphasizing what he called a principled foreign policy. This meant rejecting the romanticization of far-left regimes like those in China and Cuba, and rejecting moral equivalence between humanizing and dehumanizing political models. It meant planting Canada firmly on the side of free peoples and freedom-seeking peoples, and promoting the advance of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. It was under Stephen Harper that Canada gave His Holiness the Dalai Lama honorary Canadian citizenship. Various aspects of this agenda met sharp criticism from the foreign policy establishment in Canada. That was especially the case in terms of our prioritization of human rights in our relationship with China. But the curious thing is that despite the hand-wringing of many Canadian elites, the data shows that Canada's economic interests were not negatively affected by this policy shift. Trade with China increased significantly, especially during the early years of the Harper government, when our criticisms were most sharp. Clearly, when Canada was saying, the dress is for sale, but I am not, China was still prepared to buy and sell dresses. In 2015, Canada elected Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who had previously praised the efficiency of China's basic dictatorship. His government enthusiastically dialed back criticism of China's government, promoting the idea of free trade and beginning discussions about having an extradition treaty between Canada and China. When asked by the media, officials in the Prime Minister's office refused to criticize any aspects of China's so-called justice system, and when the Chinese Foreign Minister came to Canada, he berated journalists for asking legitimate questions about human rights, and Trudeau's Foreign Minister meekly stood beside him, offering no pushback. These concessions were supposed to usher in a golden age in relations, but that golden age never materialized. Many factors prevented the materialization of this vision of unity and cooperation, but most important were events surrounding the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou faced charges of fraud and sanctions violation in the United States. She was therefore arrested while transiting through Canada in late 2018 and is awaiting extradition proceedings. This arrest greatly angered Chinese officials who have retaliated by arresting Canadians in China and by imposing unjustified import restrictions which violate China's WTO commitments. The Chinese government wants us to drop proceedings and let Ms. Wanzhou return to China, something we have not done. Our government has been right to uphold the rule of law in this case up to now. But what is striking is how the government's message keeps getting undermined by very senior people in the governing Liberal Party, pushing the government publicly to capitulate to Chinese pressure. Canada's former ambassador to China, John McCallum, a former minister in the Trudeau government, repeatedly undercut the government's line on this case until he had to be removed from his position, and so Canada went for months without an ambassador in the midst of this crisis. And former Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien publicly encouraged the government to drop the case and let Ms. Wanzhou return to China. Jean Chrétien, remember the story I told about the 1952 Quebec election and the bridge that the town wanted? We can swim across the river, and we will not cross the river on our knees. The person who said that was Jean Chrétien, a young Liberal politician standing up against corruption in the 1950s in Quebec. It is ironic, therefore, to see him now on the opposite side of things when it comes to Canada's relationship with China. So no wonder Chinese officials think that they can make us give in by ratcheting up pressure. No wonder when such senior figures associated with the governing party are encouraging capitulation on an issue where capitulating would make a mockery of judicial independence and rule of law within our own country. Now, more recently, Canada appointed Dominic Barton as our ambassador to China to replace John McCallum. Barton has no diplomatic background, but he is a former executive with McKinsey who has done extensive business in China. He has, in his own words, drank the Kool-Aid on China. McKinsey held a corporate retreat in Kashgar, 4 miles from a Uyghur internment camp. McKinsey has also advised various Chinese state-owned companies, including one building artificial islands in the South China Sea. Now, by the way, Canada's own pension fund was also invested in companies equipping Uyghur concentration camps with surveillance technology, Hikvision, for example. When asked about the issue in the House of Commons, the government said that the job of the pension board was to maximize returns on investment. As mentioned, my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, so it strikes a chord with me when members of our government defend investments in surveillance technology for concentration camps on the basis that those investments produce a good return. I suspect that our new ambassador will be more discreet than his predecessor in his praise of China, but the appointment of a McKinsey executive sends an unmistakable signal. Notwithstanding the detention of Canadians and the trade action Canada has faced, our government is still prepared to take all of the steps necessary to smooth things over. In recent months, we have also seen multiple incidents on university campuses in Canada, where students involved in activism around human rights in China have faced intimidation, almost certainly intimidation backed by the Chinese consulate in Toronto. The Canadian government has made no response. Notwithstanding the failure of the current government's China policy, the path of appeasement and concession seems therefore to be continuing for the time being. Canada is not a small country. We are a member of the G7 and of NATO. We are the world's 10th largest economy. If it can happen to us, then it can happen anywhere. We are giving in because of the practical materialism of our elites, because they want their 40 pieces of silver, because they want their $1 million, and after all, it's only one night. So what is the solution to these problems? I have 3 brief specific suggestions. First, recognizing that combating the practical materialism of many Western elites is a longer-term process. We need to take practical steps right now to prevent Chinese government infiltration. We need to promote institutional transparency and fight corruption. This should be a critical priority of legislators. Self-interested institutions and businesses might be less likely to sell out to China if the process of selling out meant loss of reputation or other negative consequences. Secondly, we need to fortify our own spiritual foundation and develop greater confidence in our own political models. We live in societies that are built on foundations of human rights, solidarity, and subsidiarity. We believe that all human beings have immutable value, and we value their conscious and thoughtful engagement with the world on the terms set by their own minds. We believe that people ought to value the dignity of others and be concerned about their welfare, and we believe that human creativity should not be subsumed into impenetrable bureaucracies, but but rather decision-making should be at the level closest to the people so as to maximize everyone's engagement with and control of the world around them. These ideas and values are not Western or European. They are universal human values embodied in all manner of human rights declarations and characteristic of the greatest and most successful societies in human history. We should teach, defend, and promote these ideas and never behave as if they are for sale. Thirdly and finally, we need to promote our ideas and values around the world, including in China. We need to speak about them and use the tools at our disposal to spread them. We need to show free peoples and freedom-seeking peoples everywhere that we are always on their side. Every person seeking the protection of his or her fundamental human rights should know that we will stand with them even when it costs us something. Standing for human rights may have a cost, but if we are not willing to pay any cost to stand for human rights, then we have sold our souls already. We know about the institutions which the United Front uses to promote Orwellian values in our own societies. But are we confident enough to say that we will be present everywhere that they are, promoting human rights, dignity, solidarity, and subsidiarity, promoting freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law? Now, the great thing about our values is that they are inherently attractive. We don't have to buy people off in order to get them to support freedom and democracy, but we should support them in every way that we can. And when we promote universal human values, we need to draw on the intellectual histories of the societies in which we seek to make the case. We need to ensure that the real Confucius is heard over imitation presented by PRC commissars. The spiritual orientation of the Tibetan culture is well known, but I believe the same is true of Chinese culture, demonstrated by the explosive interest in Tibetan Buddhism as well as other faith traditions within China. When Chinese officials invoke their tradition as a justification for their Orwellian policies, as they do, we should know the realities of their tradition and challenge them with it. Let it not be said that we lost confidence in our values at a time when that confidence was most needed, or that we sold our children's future of freedom for the short-term benefit of a few extra dollars. The dress is for sale, but I am not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Garnet. I think what struck me is also your theme of, we have been speaking about the loss of credibility of human rights policies, mainly of the Western governments. And I think this is precisely, many governments have pursued a human rights policy which doesn't cost anything. Nobody seems to have asked oneself, what price are we willing to pay for upholding international human rights standard everywhere around the world? So as long as government and parliament doesn't pose this question to oneself, it will be, I think, difficult. So therefore, I think you raise a very, very important question, and this is one of the critical issues that every parliament and government has to deal with. Thank you very much. Now to our last speaker is Tashi Prinzula. Tashi Prinzula is currently the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama for EU and Western Europe, and is based in Brussels. I have known Tashi Prinzula for over 40 years. At that time, he was a very energetic, dedicated youth leader of the Tibetan Youth Congress, and he has been serving in the service of the Tibetan community under our administration in exile for nearly 40 years, and in many different and important capacities and positions. Tashila, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you will be able to bear with me for next 20 minutes. The topic is combating fears of a China-led Orwellian world. I take this topic quite critically because the topic assumes that there is a China-led Orwellian world, and then we are combating it. So I will speak about the Orwellian world in context of George Orwell's 1984, then how we have come to this stage of fear of a China-led Orwellian world. Is it China alone who has caused this? Or are we all complicit in this tragedy? And is there anyone who has the guts to combat this? To begin with, let's start with the beginning. In George Orwell's 1945 Animal Farm, the rebellion by animals against the atrocious man for a fair utopian world resulted in a pig, one of their own brethren called Napoleon, taking over the control of the farm and propelling a ruthless regime. This is the image of Stalin after the Russian Revolution. George Orwell is very close to us in the sense that he spent much of his time in Indian subcontinent. And personally for me, I have very great fascination for his works. Now his 1948 book called 1984 was a work which killed him, allegedly by consumption, because he was forced to finish that book to complete his deadline. And he did so in a very desolate, cold Scottish mountain in Jura, without any heating, without any proper communication. His publishers were after him. However, his book has left this legacy called Orwellian world. An English vocabulary has taken it up to signify a world which is dystopian, to describe a very authoritarian regime, where there is no freedom and Big Brother is looking down upon you, and there is thought police, newspeak, and all that comes with 1984 or the Orwellian world. So today, President Xi Jinping has replaced Stalin. Dragon has bested the bear. So around that time, Tibet also lost its freedom. All of us streamed down the Himalayan Tibetan plateau, down the Himalayan mountains into the Indian subcontinent to seek refuge. Our story of resistance began. Our 20 years of silent war began from 1959 to 1979. We started telling our story to the world. In Orwell's 1984 book, the world was divided into three ideological spheres of realm. There was the Iron Curtain of the United Soviet Socialist Republic, the Bamboo Curtain of the People's Republic of China. The rest was the free world. Nothing got in and out of the former two regions. No news, no tourism, no trade, total isolationism. The Cold War was at its deepest freeze. Total war was in the air, and everyone was ready for it. Bunkers were built across the world. We kept telling our story. Death of over 1 million Tibetans, destruction of over 6,000 monasteries, etc., etc. Now, has the world lost its battle to subdue the menace of one-man rule? To say that there is fear of China-led Orwellian world? Or are we being taken over by another Napoleon, the pig of the animal farm? Today, world begins with not prayers, but taunts and tweets and thundering threats, like bodies will be smashed, bones will be ground to powder. I hope they all do great. We are 7,000 miles away. Is it? I wrote my first petition for Tibet in 1978. A small town peanut grower in Georgia became the President of the United States of America. Human rights was his clarion call. Around the world there was hope. From a log cabin to the White House style, everyone was enamored. I could recite the American Declaration of Independence verbatim, the inalienable right of human being, dignity of man. I could recognize the signature of John Hancock. Today, it's America first, Chinese dream, Belt and Road Initiative, trade war, sanctions, Syrian war, the Brexit, the failure of democracy, Chinese soft power, smart power, sharp power, Chinese-led Orwellian world. Or is it? Where is the clarity today of the division like in the past? Or the single-minded determination to fight it out for the life of your ideology? The ping-pong policy shattered that clarity. Deng Xiaoping said, if the cat caught rat, the color didn't matter. Let's lie low and find our world in the sunshine, he said. The West said, let's bring China into our fold, and it would become one of us. Now, we are becoming one like Chinese. Or is it? The Iron Curtain was unveiled by Glasnost and Perestroika and liberated the USSR. Or so we thought. But Russia today, under Putin, is as fearsome as Stalin. Bamboo Curtain has been replaced by China Rising and Belt and Road Initiative. Today, China is almost the biblical apple. It's everyone's apple of eye. You offer yourself to be bewitched by China. So, everyone kowtows one China policy. For any small misdemeanor, you plead forgiveness, say sorry, give a sharp rebuke to the misdirected one, change your map, change your profile description, withdraw the pithy thought for the day by the Dalai Lama, self-censor is the mantra. So one country, no argument is another daily mantra. Is it out of fear of China, or out of love for China, or out of greed? Or is it? In 1973, there were only 15 Chinese students abroad, all over the world, sent by Chinese Foreign Ministry. For the last 40 years, there have been more than 5.2 million Chinese students studying abroad. And out of that, 3.1 million returned, that is 60%, returned to China, the Orwellian China. Reversely, China invites millions of students from abroad on scholarship. Last year, Chinese Ministry of Education's budget for such scholarship was 3.3 billion yuan. And there are nearly 500,000 of them now. So, The Economist, in his headline called Silk Roads, roads is Cecil Roads, said, the rich world is selling education, China is using it to buy influence. Or for that matter, the outbound Chinese tourist last year was 141 million. And according to UN data, China is the fourth best destination for tourists after Spain, after France, Spain, and the US. And China is the biggest spender as a tourist, totaling to 277 billion. So why is there so much to and froing from China? The Orwellian China. Or for that matter, in 1995, the value of China's import and export of goods totaled to 280 or 281 billion. That's about 3% of the world trade. By 27, it had grown to 4.1 trillion, or about 12.4% of the global trade. The US is second largest at 11.9%, followed by Germany at 7.9%. Is this Orwellian world, or is this the paradise of China? Or today we talk in Europe, 16 plus Europe, 17 plus Europe. That is to say that so many countries in Europe are enamored of China. Therefore, Benjamin Huss, in his article, under the headline, Europe Gets Rich in China's Open-Air Prison, says over 150 largest European companies had some presence in East Turkestan. If China is Orwellian, for Pete's sake, why do you deal with it? Or is it? Freedom House reports that 37% of the world is not free, or 24% is partly free, which says about 61% of the world population is not very free. Only 55% of the countries are free, or not free, sorry. So, is it China alone that is Orwellian, or is it that 61% of the world population lives under Orwellian world? The report indicated, among others, the declining freedom in the states, many European countries. The question then is, why are so many people around the world embracing authoritarian regimes? To the extent strongmen like Xi, Putin, Erdogan, Kim Jong-un, Duterte, LCC have become subject of admiration. So, more importantly, who fears China? North Korea has resident and non-resident diplomatic relations with nearly 80 countries. Syria has resident and non-resident diplomatic relations with nearly 79 countries. China, the Orwellian world, has diplomatic relations with 179 UN members, and 1 additional observer status. China only had 79 countries with whom it had relations in 1970s. Today, it's the leading country of fascination. So today is China almost the biblical apple, I said. It's everyone's apple of eye. China is the El Dorado. So, a common man covets visa to China. Politicians receive or covets invitation from Chinese consulate. Educational institutions, as you mentioned, seek lucrative exchange possibilities. Businessmen plead for investment, nations, subsidies, and soft loans. World leaders, an imperial reception at the Forbidden City, and the all-important photo op with the leader. In return, you self-censor, no talk of Tibet, not condemn concentration camp in East Turkestan, don't speak for the people of Hong Kong, distance yourself from the Dalai Lama, don't let him visit your country, don't allow him to speak in your university. Wither the core values, wither the free world. She, like the crown thrice offered in Julius Caesar, like Caesar, has taken the position of authority and is now enthroned the emperor. The paramount leader was anointed at the world stage in Davos in 2017. China's dream was laid before his audience. One Belt Road Initiative was acclaimed. In the same year, he declared, Chinese model was now ready for export to the nations that want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. It's then clear that we have reached this stage with the knowledge and the choice of the intelligent citizens of the US, the West, the erstwhile bastion of freedom, or people of the countries with strongmen rule. It therefore appears the world is moving itself towards Orwellian system through direct policy of the governments and the open collaboration of the public. Our insistent story of Chinese treachery has not been heeded. So, if you agree this reality, then you agree with what Mr. Farhad Manjoo, who in his writing entitled Dealing with China Isn't Worth the Moral Cost, said. We thought economic growth and technology would liberate China. Instead, it corrupted us under Xi. China is grown markedly more Orwellian, yet American, European lawmakers, Western media, world largest corporations rarely treat China as what it plainly is, a growing existential threat to human freedom across the world. So this threat is not for the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongese, or Taiwanese, or the South Mongolians. It's people across the world. So, if you have guts to combat, how can we? I can see 3 scenarios. One is, if you really wish to deal with it, then who will bell the cat? Who has the political will and the vision and wherewithal to carry it out? The time for sugar-coated sweet talk is over. I think we need someone, in a twist of the idiom, twist the dragon by the tail. Bring back the universal values as the backbone of your nation. Second scenario is just a philosophical. George Santayana said, "You are condemned if you don't learn from history." And Mr. Robert Zaleski, in his writing, said, what history teaches is tragic. In his concluding part, he said, "Time and again, national rational calculations prove as faulty as irrational forces prove overwhelming." Pericles, the Athenian leader, praised for his ability to plan for all eventualities, dies in the unanticipated plague that strikes the city. Further, he said, "Far from being able to master events or even your own desires, events and desires will sooner or later master us." The third scenario, Tibet today is quiet. But Tibet is not dead. It is certainly due to the resilience and indomitable spirit of the Tibetan people in Tibet. Tibet, East Turkestan, South Mongolia, Taiwan, and Hong Kong form the valiant vanguard of resistance to Chinese Orwellian world. Support them, make their aspirations true. If not now, when? As Hillel the seer said, and I can add, if not this way, how? Thank you.
Thank you, Tesla. Hopefully, your presentation and statements, and also the previous sessions, hopefully they have made clear that now the danger of repression and restrictions of human freedom that goes out from the totalitarian regime in Beijing does not concern or involve only minorities in the People's Republic of China, like Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongolians, and Chinese democracy and freedom activists, but it is now growing a threat to the rest of the world. If we have been able to convey this message, I think it's a great success of this forum. And finally, I just want to mention a quote, George Orwell. I think Orwell once said that the more a society drifts away from truth, the more it will hate those who speak it. And we can here, substitute for society the Chinese government. And I think the Chinese government or the society hate those who speak the truth because they sense the power and strength of the truth. And because they sense the power and strength of the truth, they fear it. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama often describes the conflict in Tibet as a battle between the power of the gun and power of the truth. And he always also says that in the short term, the power of gun may appear decisive, but in the long term and ultimately, the power of truth will prevail. Thank you. Okay, we have still time.
20 minutes for question and answer.
Okay. So I did not make my homework. First, I think I stopped you. I thought you had 15 minutes. Later, I realized you still had 5 minutes. Now, I thought the session is at the end. We still have a question and answer sessions. Okay, that's very fine. Sorry for this mistake. So now the floor is open for questions, please.
I have a problem with putting the Western world as role model. So when I take Europe, we have a history of 600 years colonialism, thousands of refugees on the way to the north and North America and Europe as well. And when I take the history of Canada, it's a bloody history as well. So you destroy the indigenous culture in your own country. So my questions to Mr. Garnet Genius would be, what would you answer a Chinese official if he would ask you, we just do what you did in your country 200 years ago?
So I think it's a great question, and I'm happy to answer it. Canada has a very troubled history in terms of the way in which governments, individuals have interacted with the Indigenous cultures of Canada, and you will see as a key part of our political discourse the desire of people to grapple with that past, to grapple with the consequences of that past in the present, and to try and as much as is possible to seek reconciliation, to make things right, and to establish the conditions through which Indigenous Canadians can restore the memory of their culture and can thrive. So we don't have to be perfect in order to speak about the frank reality that we are trying our best to grapple with our past and our present. But I think we also can make distinctions between attempts to grapple with those issues and countries where injustice is the objective of state policy, and where repression is intended and is continued, and where that kind of a grappling is simply not taking place. And certainly this is present in our discourse as well. People point to issues of religious freedom, and say, well, how can we possibly? Well, but the issue is that I wouldn't say that these are just Western values that everyone has to adopt. I would say that every society is grappling with these kinds of questions, but some are grappling with it better than others, and some have structures and systems that are counter to positive values, and some have the tools to address these things and are trying to.
To build off on the last speaker's question, I wanted to ask all the speakers what your thoughts are on the rise of populist leaders, and some of who look at China as the only challenger to the long legacy of Western neoliberalism and hegemony. Thank you.
I think we are at crossroads, as I said. The rise of populism or the rise of authoritarianism is a reflection on the changing political spectrum across the world. Primarily, it's, I think, now quite well-known fact that there is a serious issue with democracy. There is feeling that democracy is failing. And there is serious examples of such cases across the world, even in Europe. It is not a criticism of Europe or the United States or the Western world, but it's a tragedy of modern history. As democracy fails to answer democratic questions, then there is tendency to look to alternatives. So we have many alternatives. And this is not just a statement, but a practical realization across Europe. You have elections and you have no governments for years. You have decisions made through elections and decisions are not implemented for years. People are in street year after year. The issue still remains unresolved. People are out in the streets calling to the governments to do something, and government is unable to answer to that people's wish. Recently, in Athens, there was, like we have Geneva Forum, they had a democracy forum. And they came out with 5 important, nowadays, what we call takeaways. One is division. We and them, nationalism and multiculturalism, as you say, liberalism and illiberalism. Inequality. Restoring faith to core values, as I mentioned about core values. Collapse of the traditional party, two-party system. And use and misuse of new and social media. And I would like to add one. Whereas the elections are 5-year term decision. So populism depends on 5-year policy. Whereas other nations, the authoritarian nations, they think in terms of 50 years. That is the difference.
Maybe just a slightly different take. I mean, and this maybe comes out of the particularities of the Canadian experience, but I struggle to wrap my head around the use of the term populism as sort of a multinational concept that can have a clear definition, because it seems to me that many of the things we call populism are in reality very, very different from each other. Obviously, there are things that go under the name populism that I don't like, but there is also a sense in which the concerns raised by people identified under this label are raising real and legitimate concerns. Think, for instance, ways in which global trade patterns may have impacted people in their livelihoods, and government policy kind of didn't consider the transition or the way of limiting the negative impact on them. So, I mean, I think we need to be kind of careful and maybe more precise with some of the terminology around populism. I will say the Canadian experience is unique, perhaps in a few respects. One is that we have a pretty strong pro-immigration consensus across the political spectrum. My Conservative Party, when in power, had the highest sustained immigration levels in the country's history up until that point, and we fine-tuned our immigration system to emphasize meeting our employment needs and so forth. And we generally have strong public support for open trade policies as well, and that's because I think our trade policy has been open but strategic and has benefited Canadians in the process historically. I also think, we have in the part of Canada where I come from, Western Canada, we have something that we call populism that really flowered a few decades ago that's in reality very different than what is being called populism in the international discourse. But it had some similarities, I suppose. It was the idea that if everyday people have access to the information they need and are are thinking themselves individually about the common good, about the future, that their involvement in the decision-making process is better than a decision-making process dominated by elites. And I think the call to inclusion, to more voices in the political discourse, if you call that populism, then great. If you don't, then if you want to call it something else, then that's fine too.
If I may add, I think there is an important technological change occurred. Our system, the democracy as we know it, was effectively established at the end of the 18th century. At that time, when we were talking about a parliament, the idea was exactly like, let's elect some person that will represent our region and send that person riding a horse to some city which is like 2 weeks ago from us. At that time, we were very much dependent of that this person is in particular honest, fulfilling or acting in that office as it should be. However, the time changed because, since that time, we have the opportunity to directly see what's going on in these capitals, how the people are, and quite often we see scandals, we see misuses, and any misbehavior you can even imagine. The people can see it, and they can interact it. Like when we are talking about the social networks, everyone from like the other side of the world can immediately criticize any of my actions. Like maybe if this is being streamed on Facebook, probably I'm already getting some criticism under that post. However, this is not transforming into any sort of political action. People have the opportunity to see and watch. However, they are much restricted in participation, and this is what creates the frustration. You elect officials to an office for 4 or 5 years. However, you have no right to dismiss that person from the office when there is a misbehavior. So I think our system really needs an upgrade, really needs to approve those changes, incorporate the technology we have involved. We don't have to change our values, we just have to take our values into account and implement it into the solutions we are using because they are a little bit outdated.
My question is to Sarah. Since we're in Geneva, one area where the Chinese government is trying to take advantage of the international community is the system provided by the United Nations for civil society representation, whether here in Geneva or in New York or international fora. That includes creating its own Congos, if you will. What can we do in terms of civil society and the international community to sort of take China to task and be responsible to the international community on such matters?
Okay, thank you for your question. I would agree that the concerns around Congos are governmentally organized NGOs, those that are not independent, that do pursue and advance official policy objectives of the Chinese government, or for that matter, many others, are an increasing challenge to the UN and to the way in which space operates. I think there are very real risks in seeking to review or to identify who is a real NGO and who is not. I think it's a very risky, slippery slope to undertake. But I think that those of us who do want to see the UN have a space maintained for legitimate, independent, and human rights focused discussion can do is to be there. is to try to take up that space, to try to provide the counterbalance, and also to provide as much information as we can about those other organizations who are there. At the end of the day, I think we would all agree that, we have freedom of speech. They have a right to express their views. But I think ensuring that those who are listening are fully informed about the background, about the identity, about any potential connections to government bodies is incredibly important. At the point where those actors take specific action to intimidate or to silence, I think we move into a different space, though.
Any questions? This is to address to Garnet. There are over 300,000 Chinese Canadians living in Hong Kong. And then I have talked about quite a few, actually not a few, but quite a large number of Canadians have shown grave concern about what's going on. To what extent will the current government do something about the situation? I mean, like yesterday I talked about a Citibank derivative trader being taken away by 3 riot police, and then there's a Manulife, and then there's some insurance company, people from my group, 2047 Hong Kong Monitor. The last guy was contesting for the Peak District. They are so concerned about the election coming in on November 24th, which is a Sunday, could be cancelled. And I was just reading from Apple Daily that two of the contestants were beaten. So what could Canada do? Since Hong Kong has over 1 million foreign passport holders, and I think close to 500,000 are Canadians. I mean, would Justin Trudeau government do something, and how about you as someone who is so close to humanitarian issues? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and I would just further underline, first of all, the connections between Canada and Hong Kong by saying that if you know this, that in Hong Kong there's a cemetery for many Canadian soldiers who were killed in the fight to defend Hong Kong's freedom during the Second World War, and of course, now we see another battle going on for the defense of Hong Kong's freedom, and I would hope that Canadians would be, in whatever way is prudent and effective, engaging and supporting Hong Kong as well. So a few things. I mean, it was probably clear from my remarks that I'm not a member of the governing party. We just had an election, and we have a minority parliament, which provides some, I think, interesting additional opportunities through parliamentary mechanisms for opposition parties to get together and increase pressure on the government, especially around our relationship with China. And I'm hopeful we'll be able to produce some results through that and other channels. How Canada should engage, I think one of the things about Canadian engagement is that we generally act most effectively when we act multilaterally. We're part of many of the major international organizations. We're part of the G7, we're part of the Commonwealth, we're part of the Francophonie. We can engage through those organizations in pushing a coordinated response to Chinese aggression and to the situation in particular in Hong Kong. And I would hope to see, as a starting point, Canada prepared to convene and push those discussions through multilateral fora. There are steps we can take directly as well. There are tools that we have available. I was speaking to someone earlier about Magnitsky sanctions. In the last Parliament, we adopted legislation that allows the government to sanction individual human rights abusers, in effect, to limit those people's travel, and also including in those sanctions asset freezes. This is, I think, a very strong and effective tool for deterring human rights abusers. It's, of course, most effective when it's done in coordination with allies, but it sends the message to people that are considering involvement in human rights abuses that their ability to travel or even to escape if the system turns around on them at some point Bitcoin will be limited if they cross a certain threshold. The Magnitsky Act is only as good as its use. Parliament has passed it to empower the government to sanction individuals, but the government has to have the courage to list individuals under it. But I think that is a good tool for the government to have in the toolbox in response to some of the escalating abuses that we are seeing in different parts of China, including Hong Kong.
So, thank you very much. You all have been wonderful panelists. And I think during these 2 days, a lot of discussions or talks has been about the technological possibilities and threat and dangers of the new tools. But during our session here, we try to also discuss or bring in some of the ethical, philosophical, moral questions that is related with human rights policy, with defending the principle of universality and indivisibility of the UN Declaration of Human Rights everywhere in the world. So I think this aspect is also very, very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kesang Genzala, for moderating this very insightful expert panel, and also to all the panelists and speakers for highlighting the threats of the Orwellian-led government, China-led Orwellian world, and also telling and giving us suggestions and ideas and important examples of how the international community as a whole and individual states can combat this. Thank you. I now request the President of the Central Tibetan Administration, Honorable Dr. Lobsang to hand over tokens of mementos. Thank you, Kong Sikula. We will be starting the next session, which is the declaration of the Geneva Forum shortly. Just give us 2 minutes, please.
Drafting team Secretary Kamaching La to be on the stage, and my colleague Mr. Chugila.
From the experience of the two-day event that we had, so we have, from this, the discussion that we had, we thought it important, and we had also a kind of consensus and discussion with our experts that we'll have a declaration devised for this Geneva Forum 2019, and so I think it's very appropriate that this is the second year that we are having this forum in Geneva. So I would request my colleague, Ms. Chinichuji, to kindly read out the declaration paragraph-wise. So we'll, yeah, please continue.
Thank you so much, Khun Kamla. As he mentioned, we have received comments and edits from all the experts and the witnesses who were present for the Geneva Forum, and this is a draft declaration. I will be reading this declaration para-wise, and if we have any comments from you, we will take a note of it and come out with the final. If we do not have, we will pass it as it is. The draft of the Geneva Forum Declaration 2019. We, the experts and witnesses at the 2019 Geneva Forum on China's high-tech repression and freedom of religion from 14 to 15 November 2019, express our grave concern over the reports of high-tech systemic violations of human rights, including freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion and belief, freedom of movement and peaceful assembly, right to privacy, right against torture, and the likes enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, perpetrated by the government of People's Republic of China against its own so-called ethnic minorities, including Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, and Hong Kongers, and human rights defenders. Do we have any comments or suggestions or edits for this paragraph? Yes, please.
In the fifth line, the Republic of China against, I suggest aid the Taiwanese and it's also called, because Taiwan won't be absent in the declaration, and Taiwan is not a ethnic minority of China, so I suggest Taiwanese put after the word against.
Okay, I have made a note of it. Against Taiwanese. Thank you. For the lady, please.
Yeah, just a question. I mean, why are we saying against its own so-called ethnic minorities? Why don't we just say against Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, and human rights defenders? Why are we using the word in our statement ethnic minorities?
Yes, Mr. Espanti.
Yes, I suggest to include beyond Uyghurs other Turkic peoples. We have thousands and thousands of Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Tatars who are detained in Xinjiang. Thank you.
And shall we, we'll add this after, say, Hong Kong, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Hong Kongers, and Turkic minorities.
I would put it after Uyghurs. You can say Uyghurs and other Turkic
minorities.
Minorities which comprehend all the people that speak Turkic languages.
Turkic minorities.
This is the way they express themselves.
Are you suggesting that we use the word Turkic minorities or
Turkic people?
Turkic people?
If minorities, as it has been said, it's a way maybe not very.
Turkic minorities. Okay. Yeah. Turkic, Mongolians, Hong Kongers, human rights defenders, and Taiwanese.
I would say other Turkic people because Uyghurs are Turkic. Okay.
Okay.
I don't know if it's correct to say peoples as plural in English, and say not just a person but people.
Okay. In the second paragraph.
Yes, please.
Thank you. It's just semantic, but the UN language, including the UDHR and ICCPR, says freedom of religion or belief, not freedom. That's okay.
I'm extremely sorry. Could you please repeat?
Of course. Just to say that in UN language it's semantic, but in the UDHR and ICCPR it says freedom of religion or belief, not and. I know it's small, but in the second, so it's in the same paragraph in the second line, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll move. Okay, let's move to the second paragraph.
Oh, are we good with it?
Yeah.
And we are moving to the next one. Are deeply concerned by the reports of high-tech religious persecution carried out by the government of People's Republic of China against people of faith, including Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Falun Gong practitioners, aimed at destruction of the core belief systems and religious traditions of the believers.
Okay.
Good to go?
Good to go, yeah. Third paragraph.
Gravely note the repressive policies of the Communist Party of China and its government to destroy the distinct way of life of ethnic minorities, including their rich heritage, cultural diversity, language, and identity. Are gravely concerned by the sophisticated surveillance used by China, including usage of artificial intelligence, facial recognition, biometric registration, data mining, phone spyware, GPS tagging, drones, etc., and the new social credit system being introduced, which will perpetuate the oppressive regime of the Communist Party of China.
Okay, next.
Okay. Note with deep concern the export, sale, transfer, and servicing of the high-tech surveillance systems and internet controls by China's autocratic regime across the globe, which is resulting in declining democracies and rise of autocrats in the world. Okay. And thereby we call upon the government of People's Republic of China to stop with immediate effect the abuse of technology and the high-tech human rights violations carried out against its people in general and the ethnic minorities in particular, the high-tech religious persecution of people of faith, and the export, sale, transfer, and servicing of its high-tech surveillance tools to other countries. Respect and guarantee all human rights, including the freedom of religion and belief, and the right of the believers to choose their own religious leaders, as written in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Just a minor change.
Yeah, please.
Perhaps in the first paragraph we could use the same wording as we do above, because here again we're talking about its people and ethnic minorities.
Okay.
And I think we could either say people living within the boundaries of the People's Republic of China, so you keep it very general, but I think we should name the people who are suffering most at the hands of these policies. But I think avoiding the term its and avoiding the term ethnic minorities in this context.
Under the Chinese rule. Including people in general, including people in general, including people in Chinese rule in general, people in Chinese rule in general,
including Japan's movies and other. Yes.
I have a suggestion. There should be something like ensure personal data protection and maintain transparency in public affairs. I would probably add it at the end of the second paragraph, if possible.
Respect and guarantee all human rights, including the freedom of religion. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm especially concerned about the personal data protection, because I think that's the core issue within the Chinese system, and it should be addressed, because not such the surveillance technology itself, but the data mining on the existing data received by other ways are the source of the problems.
Okay.
It's probably not the place to put it. Maybe it belongs to rather at the end of the next.
You want this added in the second paragraph, respect and guarantee all human rights, including freedom of religion or belief and the right of the believers to choose their own religious leaders as written in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and
ensure personal data protection.
Ensure personal data protection.
And maintain transparency in public affairs.
Data protection and maintain, sir?
Maintain transparency.
Transparency. Okay, transparency in public affairs.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, yes. Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay.
People against people under Chinese rule, including, we can just remove the general, I think, rule including the Okay, is that fine? Or is there any, because we don't have much time left. we still have the concluding sessions to do, Okay, please.
If I may just very quickly with the first paragraph, I mean, at the very end, not necessarily specifically, just add and all the other people inside and outside the People's Republic of China. Because as we have spoken during this conference, this issue is now being exported to the rest of the world, from Africa to, I mean, even Europe and North America at the end of the day.
You mean the second paragraph?
Yeah, sorry, of course. After the Taiwanese, just a quick note to acknowledge the fact that it's also other Chinese people and all the other nations in the world that are quite often suffering from this.
Against
Could you repeat the word that you said?
Right, it's just like after the Taiwanese, all the other people inside and outside of the People's Republic.
By that we can remove the Taiwanese because we are talking about the affected people both inside and outside China. So is that fine because it become a little lengthy? The sentence is going a little long,
We are trying to keep as concise as possible as well. And people outside. Against people under its rule, including
the affected people both inside and outside.
kurang gimana? Both inside.
Inside and outside China. Doesn't work.
The sentence
Is that always if we add like people beyond its borders, that should, that will also include Taiwan, other affected people. Is that all right? Okay, thank you.
Call upon the governments and the European Union to create a binding human rights compliant safeguards regime for the investment, development, manufacture and export of surveillance tools and internet controls, and on the UN to provide all possible support and cooperation in this regard. Call upon the international community and organizations, governments, civil societies to press China to respect and guarantee human rights and to stop the export of tools of authoritarianism. Call upon the governments, international institutions, and business enterprises, including multinational companies, to fully and meaningfully implement the UN guiding principles and relevant treaty obligations in their business dealings with China, and to stop funding or investing in research and manufacturing of surveillance tools by China.
Just maybe technical comment.
Yes.
On the sentence I've added, I would replace the "and," which is between rights, and "ensure" with dash. Comma.
Where is that?
Which paragraph?
Respect and guarantee paragraph.
Oh, respect and guarantee.
There is "and ensure" and maintain, which is also that's just a technical change to replace. I would replace the previous one. This one.
And ensure personal data protection and
human rights, comma.
Oh. I think it looks better.
Yes, please, Mr. Esbenti.
Can you go back where you list religions?
Yes.
Please. Where is it? You can see it.
This one.
Yes, I would probably add also Taoists and believers in Chinese folk religions. We have a chronicled destruction of temples and ancestral halls and all that. So maybe we can include Taoists and believers in folk religion. And another suggestion where we say are gravely concerned, we may probably also make some reference to DNA profiling, which is so big now, and it's very dangerous.
So the Taoists and believers in folk religions is good?
Yeah.
And the next is?
Are gravely concerned by the sophisticated surveillance used by China.
Yes.
We may mention DNA profiling somewhere.
So can we pass this Geneva Forum Declaration 2019?
Thank you.
Thank you very much all. Thank you.
Thank you so much.